A struggling single dad offers to fix a stranger's broken fence, only to discover she just bought the land he's been dreaming of for years. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The wind had howled all night, like it had something to prove. By morning, the world was littered with broken branches, scattered leaves, and a silence thick with aftermath. Jack Morgan stepped out onto the porch, mug of lukewarm coffee in one hand, the other tucked into the pocket of his jacket. His eyes drifted toward the far edge of the property, and there it was, the damage. The fence was down, not entirely, but enough. 2 posts split at the base, rails scattered like bones across the frostbitten grass. It wasn't even his fence. Technically, it belonged to the landlord, who hadn't set foot on the land in years. But Jack had been the one patching it since the first winter after Lily passed. Back then, it gave him something to do with his hands, something to fix when everything else felt broken beyond repair. He set the coffee on the porch rail, whistled for the dog, and made his way out to the field. The air was crisp, sharp enough to sting his lungs with each breath. His daughter Ellie loved this stretch of land, called it the Dreaming Hill. It wasn't much, just a slope with a view of the orchard on one side and the ridge line on the other, but it was where she built fairy houses, where she laid on her back and named clouds, and that fence, rickety as it was, kept the world a little more still for her. Jack crouched near the broken post, fingers brushing over the jagged wood. He sighed. He could try to call the landlord, but it'd be easier, faster, to just fix it himself, like always. Besides, he didn't want Ellie to come running out here after school and see her favorite place torn and open like a wound. A gust of wind rolled through, bending the tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out once, then vanished into the trees. Jack stood up, dusted off his knees, and walked back toward the shed. Time to grab his toolbox. There was work to do, and some places, he figured, were worth fixing, even if they didn't technically belong to you. Jack had just started resetting the first fence post when he noticed movement near the edge of the tree line. At first, he thought it might be a deer, maybe one of the does that liked to wander the property line at dusk. But when he stood and squinted through the morning haze, he saw her. A woman. Alone. She was walking slowly along the boundary where his land met the unkept slope that led down to the creek. Wrapped in a long camel-colored wool coat, with dark boots that didn't look made for mud, she moved like someone measuring something. Her gaze shifted from the ground to the horizon, thoughtful, like she wasn't just passing through, she was taking stock. Jack leaned on his shovel, one hand shielding his eyes. She didn't notice him at first. Her hair was tied back neatly, and she held a leather-bound notebook in one gloved hand. Occasionally she'd pause to jot something down. Her posture was too upright, her coat too clean, her presence too deliberate. She didn't belong here, not in boots like that, not on muddy farmland that didn't show up on any map unless you already knew where to look. Definitely not from around here. He watched for a few more seconds, half expecting her to pull out a camera or a surveyor's tool. Instead, she stepped carefully over a fallen branch, then froze as she finally looked up and spotted him. Their eyes met. Briefly. Hers were unreadable from this distance, but she didn't startle or look away. She simply nodded, a polite gesture, as if acknowledging that she'd wandered close enough to be noticed. Jack returned the nod and went back to digging. The last thing he needed was to stir up drama with a stranger who might be scouting the land. Too many folks had been sniffing around lately, dropping big city offers and promises of development. He'd heard the talk at the feed store about new money looking for quiet places to turn loud. Still, something about her was different. She didn't look like a realtor or a corporate shark. She didn't carry herself like someone trying to impress. She looked curious. Jack kept working, but every so often he glanced back toward the tree line, where the stranger in the wool coat had paused again, her notebook open, her eyes fixed not on the land, but on the broken fence he was trying to mend. By late afternoon, the fence was halfway upright again, and Jack was starting to feel the kind of ache that settled deep in his shoulders after a long day's work. He took a swig from his thermos and leaned against a post, letting the quiet stretch out across the field like a blanket. The woman in the wool coat had disappeared earlier, but now she was back, standing just beyond the property line, notebook tucked under her arm, hands in her coat pockets. She wasn't alone this time. Ellie, Jack's 7-year-old daughter, had wandered up the hill after school, backpack bouncing, hair coming loose from its braid. She spotted the woman immediately and, being Ellie, made a beeline toward her with no hesitation and even less regard for personal space. Jack straightened. "Ellie," he called, wary. "Don't bother." It's okay," the woman said, smiling, as Ellie stopped right in front of her, clutching something small and brown in both hands. "Hi," Ellie said, breathless, from the climb. "I'm Ellie. My dad's fixing the fence. I'm helping by collecting acorns." The woman crouched to her level. "Acorns, huh? That's important work." Ellie nodded seriously, then opened her hands to reveal 5 mottled acorns. "I'm saving these to plant a forest right here on the hill." The woman raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A whole forest?" "Yep, because Dad says big things grow from small starts, and this hill's my favorite place. I want it to stay beautiful forever." Jack stood a few feet away, frozen, not by fear, but by the sight of Ellie explaining something so simple and sacred, like it was the most obvious truth in the world. The woman glanced up at him, then back to Ellie. "That's a very good reason. May I hold one?" Ellie chose the roundest acorn and placed it gently in the woman's hand. "That one's lucky." The woman turned it over with care, then smiled softly. "I believe you." Ellie looked proud. "You can come plant one with us if you want." The woman hesitated for half a second, just long enough for Jack to wonder if she'd politely decline. But she didn't. "I'd like that," she said. And just like that, the fence wasn't the only thing taking root on that hillside. The next morning brought clear skies and the kind of brittle cold that left frost clinging to the tall grass long after sunrise. Jack was already out by the fence again, sleeves rolled, breath rising in soft puffs. He heard the crunch of boots before he saw her, the woman in the wool coat, back again, this time without the notebook, just her gloved hands and that unreadable expression. She stopped a few yards away, her eyes scanning the mended stretch of wood before settling on him. "Thought I'd come see how the repairs were going," she said, voice calm, polite. Jack straightened, adjusting the wrench in his hand. "Coming along," he replied, nodding at the half-repaired fence line. "Still a few rotted posts up ahead, though. Might be safer to stay clear." She tilted her head. "Thanks for the warning." There was an awkward beat of silence. Jack cleared his throat and went back to work, tightening a bolt that probably didn't need much more tightening. She lingered, her shadow stretching long in the morning light. "You looking to buy property out here?" he asked, keeping his tone even, but his eyes focused on the fence. The woman blinked. "Why do you ask?" Jack finally met her gaze. "A lot of folks passing through these days, looking to develop. Last guy wanted to turn the ridge into a private golf course." She smiled faintly, but there was something behind it. Surprise, maybe, or disappointment. "And what did you say to him?" Jack shrugged. Didn't have to say much. He got his car stuck in the mud, left, and never came back. The woman let out a short, amused breath. "Well, I don't play golf." "That's good," Jack said dryly. "We don't have much use for bulldozers around here either." She took a step closer, not offended, just quieter now. "I'm not here to change things." Jack nodded once, but didn't soften. That's what they all say, right before the surveyors show up. He didn't mean to be rude, not exactly, but this land, the view, the silence, it wasn't just scenery. It was the only thing holding the edges of his life together, and he'd seen too many outsiders arrive with smiles and promises only to leave behind cracked earth and higher rent. The woman didn't argue. She just looked past him toward the hill where Ellie had planted her acorns. "I'm just walking," she said gently, "trying to figure out what kind of place this is." Jack wiped his hands on a rag and gave her a slow, assessing look. "Well," he said finally, "it's the kind of place where fences break and we fix them ourselves. That usually tells you everything you need to know." The sun hadn't climbed far when Jack heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He didn't look up right away, figured it was just the mail truck, or maybe old Harold from the feed store dropping off parts like he sometimes did. But then came the unmistakable sound of careful footsteps, not hurried, not hesitant, but deliberate. He looked up from the toolbox just as the woman in the wool coat approached, her hair tied back tighter today, a coffee carrier in one hand and a pair of worn leather gloves in the other. "You're back," he said, brushing sawdust from his jacket. Not a question, more of an observation with a dash of curiosity he didn't try too hard to hide. She nodded and held out one of the steaming cups. "Black, no sugar, right? Figured you might still be out here." Jack hesitated for a beat, then took the coffee. "Thanks." She pulled on the gloves, clearly not built for show. "Mind if I help today?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "You ever fix a fence before?" She smiled. "I rid fast." He couldn't help it. He laughed, the sound catching even him off guard. "Reading's not going to save your hands from splinters." "I brought gloves," she said, wiggling her fingers. Jack looked her over, searching for the catch. There wasn't one, not in her eyes, not in her stance. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't trying to sell anything. She just looked like someone who'd shown up for the sake of showing up. "Suit yourself," he said finally, handing her a spare hammer. "Start with that post down there. Tap the nails in until they hold, then I'll come behind and tighten them." She nodded and walked off, boots crunching through the frost-tipped grass. Jack watched her for a moment, still half expecting her to give up once the work got tedious, or messy, or cold. But she didn't. She worked quietly, methodically, wiping her brow with her sleeve like someone who'd done this before, or maybe like someone who needed to. And for the first time since she'd appeared on that field, Jack didn't feel the need to keep his guard all the way up, just most of the way. They worked side by side for the better part of the morning. No small talk, just the sound of metal meeting wood, boots scuffing against soil, and the occasional grunt as stubborn nails refused to cooperate. Jack wasn't the type to fill silence just to hear his own voice, and she didn't seem to mind the quiet either. But after the third post was hammered in, and they both paused to catch their breath, she finally broke it. "I never caught your name," she said, brushing sawdust off her gloves. Jack glanced her way, wiping his hands on a rag. "Jack Morgan." She nodded like she already knew it. "Ellie's dad." That got a half smile out of him. "Yeah, that's how most people know me these days." There was a pause before she added, "I'm Claire." Jack waited a beat. "Claire?" She didn't flinch. "Just Claire." He studied her for a moment. It wasn't evasive, just honest in a way that didn't need explaining. She wasn't hiding. She was choosing what mattered. "All right, Claire," he said, tilting his head toward the next section of fence. "That corner's next." She followed without question, hammer in hand. But as they worked, Jack couldn't shake the sense that there was more behind her eyes than she let on. Most strangers in town announced themselves with business cards or long-winded backstories. Claire didn't offer either. She wasn't trying to win anyone over, and that alone made her presence feel different, real, in a strange kind of way. "So what brings you out here?" he asked eventually, driving a nail into place. Claire straightened and dusted her coat. "Just passing through?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "You always pass through with zoning maps and boundary markers?" She gave a small shrug, lips curling at the edge. "I've been thinking about settling down, somewhere quieter, somewhere slower." Jack looked around at the open sky, the crooked trees, the half-finished fence. "Well, you've found slow, all right. Quieter, too, unless the rooster next door gets going." Claire smiled. "Then maybe I'm in the right place." Jack didn't answer. He just handed her the next plank. Something about her being here felt temporary, but also like the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. The sun climbed higher, casting a soft gold over the field as Jack and Claire settled into a rhythm. The kind of rhythm that doesn't need to be forced. He measured. She hammered. He adjusted the line. She held the rails in place. There was comfort in the simplicity. Two people mending something piece by piece, letting the work speak for them. But eventually words began to slip through the cracks. "You ever build a fence before?" Jack asked, glancing sideways as Claire wiped her brow with the back of her glove. "First time," she admitted. "Though I once helped build a garden box. Didn't hold up long. Tomatoes took over." Jack chuckled. "Tomatoes'll do that. They take what they want." There was a pause as he handed her another nail. "I like the soil here," she said softly. "It's got that dark, rich color you don't see everywhere." "You sound like someone who knows her dirt." Claire grinned faintly. "Grew up around farms, left as fast as I could. Took me years to realize I missed it." Jack nodded slowly. "That's how it goes." She looked at him curious. "And you? Have you always been here?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Pretty much. Born 20 miles out. Met Ellie's mom in town. Stayed put ever since." Claire's expression softened. "Ellie's lucky. She talks about you like you hung the moon." Jack looked down, swallowing a knot in his throat. "She's my whole world. After Lily passed, this land, that girl, kept me moving." Claire didn't say sorry, didn't look away, just nodded like she understood something she didn't need to explain. They worked in silence again, but this time it felt warmer, like the air between them had shifted, softened. "You ever think about leaving?" Claire asked, adjusting the rail. Jack leaned on his hammer. "Sometimes. But then I look at that hill, or Ellie collecting acorns like their treasure, and I remember maybe small dreams are the ones that stick." Claire smiled. "That's the kind of dream I'm looking for." Jack didn't say much after that, just tightened the last bolt and moved to the next post. But something had shifted, not just in the fence, but in the space between two strangers who suddenly weren't so strange anymore. The fence stood tall again by late afternoon, leaning just slightly in that way old wood always does, like it's earned the right to rest. Jack brushed the dirt off his jeans and took a long pull from his water bottle, squinting up at the sky streaked with early evening gold. Claire stood beside him, arms folded, her gloves dangling from one hand. "Not bad," she said, admiring their work. Jack gave a half smile. "It'll hold. Might not be pretty, but it'll keep the deer out." Just then Ellie came bounding up the hill, her backpack flopping behind her like a parachute. "You've finished it," she said, arms wide. "Can we go for our walk now?" Jack started to answer, but Ellie had already turned to Claire. "Do you want to come too? There's an orchard over that ridge. I pick the good ones before the birds do." Claire hesitated for a heartbeat, then smiled. "I'd love to." The three of them walked together down the slope, their boots soft against the soil. The air smelled of dry leaves and ripening fruit. Ellie skipped ahead, humming a tune only she knew, while Jack and Claire followed at a slower pace, side by side. The orchard wasn't big, just a few rows of gnarled old trees that leaned slightly east, shaped by years of wind. Apples hung low, some already fallen, their skins mottled but sweet. Ellie darted from tree to tree, inspecting each one like a jeweler eyeing precious stones. "She knows this place better than anyone," Jack said, watching her. "Even has names for some of the trees." Claire smiled. "Does she have a favorite?" Jack nodded. "That one." He pointed to a crooked tree near the center. "She calls it Mrs. Curley, says it talks to her when it's windy." Claire laughed softly. "I think I would have liked her as a kid." Jack glanced at her. "You say that like you weren't." Claire was quiet for a moment, then, "I don't remember being allowed to be." They walked a little farther in silence. Ellie reappeared, holding out 2 apples, one for each of them. "They're not perfect," she said, "but they're ours." Claire took hers with both hands, as if accepting a gift far more delicate than fruit. Jack bit into his. "That's the best kind." As the sun dipped behind the trees, they lingered in that orchard. Three people from different worlds, sharing apples, stories, and the kind of peace that doesn't come around often but knows exactly when to show up. The letter came in a plain white envelope. No return addresses, just his name scrawled in rushed ink, Jack Morgan, as if even the sender didn't want to linger on the thought. He found it wedged in the crack of the front screen door when he came back from the orchard, Ellie skipping just ahead of him, humming with a pocket full of apple seeds and big ideas. He waited until she was inside, coat hung up, shoes kicked off, already rummaging for her sketchbook. Then he opened it. The paper was thin, official-looking, folded once, typed in stiff, sterile language that didn't bother to soften the blow. The landowner, absent for years and unreachable by phone, had decided to sell. The property, house, field, orchard, was being transferred to a private buyer. Jack had 30 days to vacate. No renewal, no discussion. Just an address at the bottom for legal inquiries and a thin line of ink that barely passed for a signature. His hand tightened around the page. He sat on the edge of the porch, elbows on his knees, staring out at the land. The same land he'd mowed every summer, shoveled every winter. The same porch he'd carried Lily over, the same stretch of hill Ellie had turned into her little kingdom. None of it had ever technically been his, but somehow that had never mattered, until now. Inside, Ellie was drawing a treehouse on stilts, planning the one she wanted him to build next spring. He folded the letter and slid it into his jacket pocket. He couldn't tell her, not yet. She deserved to keep dreaming a little longer, deserved her fairy hills and apple trees and the small, beautiful world they'd built with tired hands and quiet hope. He'd figure something out. He always had. The wrench in his hand, the calluses on his fingers, they had gotten him this far. Jack stood, brushed off his jeans, and walked back inside. "Dinner soon, kiddo," he said. Ellie looked up, smiling. "Can we plant the apple seeds tomorrow?" He nodded. "Yeah, tomorrow sounds good." The bell above Rosie's diner gave its usual half-hearted jingle as Jack pushed open the door, the smell of fried eggs and old coffee wrapping around him like an old jacket. It was the kind of place where the booths had names and the regulars didn't need menus. He hadn't planned on stopping in, just meant to grab a cup to go and maybe a slice of pie for Ellie, but routine had a way of pulling you in. He didn't notice her at first. Claire was tucked into a corner booth near the window, her coat draped over the seat beside her, a cup of tea untouched at her elbow. Her head was bent, focused, pen in hand. At first glance it looked like she was just reading, until he saw what lay open across the table. A zoning map. Jack froze. It was the county's layout. He recognized the shaded blocks, the contour lines of the creek, and the faint dotted line that ran straight through the property he called home. She wasn't just looking, she was studying and writing. Something in his chest went cold. He forced himself forward, ordering his coffee in a low voice and pretending not to glance her way. But Claire looked up anyway, catching him mid-step, her face lit up in recognition. "Jack," she said warmly, closing the folder a little too quickly. He nodded, polite but tight. "Didn't expect to see you here." She gestured to the papers, "Trying to get familiar with the area. I like to know where I'm walking." His eyes narrowed slightly. "That a habit or part of the job?" Claire paused, then offered a half smile. "Let's just say, I like to understand the bones of a place." Jack said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You always carry county zoning maps when you're just passing through?" Claire's smile faded, not defensive, just measured. "It's not what you think." Jack gave a short nod, the kind that didn't mean agreement. "Well, I should get back. Ellie's waiting." "Jack," Claire said quietly, "I'm not here to hurt anything." He looked at her one last time, eyes steady but unreadable. "That's what worries me." And then he turned and left, coffee in hand, pie forgotten. By the end of the week, the whispers had started. They always did. It began at the feed store, Harold muttering under his breath as he rang up a sack of seed, something about land changing hands and outsiders poking around with checkbooks. Then it moved to the diner, where the regulars sipped coffee slower than usual, their glances over the rims of their mugs just a little sharper. By Sunday it had reached the church steps, where Mrs. Kinney spoke in a low, urgent voice to anyone who'd listen. Someone had bought the old Turner field. And not just the field, the surrounding acres, too. Probably a developer, she whispered, lips tight. Or worse, some corporation looking to turn it all into prefab houses or another vineyard for tourists. Jack heard the rumors everywhere he went, passing through the lumber yard, at the gas station, even waiting in line at the post office. All of it speculation. No one had proof, just names half remembered and contracts no one had seen. But that didn't stop the talk. If there was one thing this town did faster than gossip, it was worry. And Jack? He didn't say much, just nodded when people asked if he'd heard, kept his jaw set tight, and drove home a little slower than usual, his eyes drifting more and more often toward the hill, toward the fence he'd rebuilt, and the orchard Ellie still visited after school. He hadn't told her yet. About the letter, about the clock quietly ticking down on the only home she'd ever known. Now the town was humming with it, with fear, with stories, with the deep, familiar ache of uncertainty. At the diner, he overheard someone say the buyer had deep pockets and no roots. At the hardware store, someone else swore they saw a survey team 2 counties over asking about utilities. Jack's grip tightened around his wrench every time he heard Claire's name in his head, even if it hadn't yet crossed anyone's lips, because deep down, in that part of him that had always known when things were too good to last, he feared the whispers might be right. And worse, he feared he already knew the answer. The late afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across the newly repaired fence. Jack had returned to the hill out of habit more than purpose, his toolbox untouched at his side. He stood near the edge, eyes on the horizon where the orchard met the sky. Hands resting on the rails he'd hammered in with Claire just days before. He didn't hear her until she was close. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you," Claire said softly. Jack didn't flinch. "Not many people come up here unless they're lost." "I'm not lost," she said. He glanced at her, then turned back to the view. She stood a step behind him, silent for a moment, before speaking again. "Why do you care so much about this place?" she asked, her voice gentle, but direct. "This hill? The field? The old fence? I mean, it's just land, isn't it?" Jack didn't answer right away. He took a slow breath, then another. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but low, like the words were pulled from someplace buried deep. "Because it's where I can breathe," he said, "and where my daughter dreams." Claire said nothing, but he could feel her watching him, like she hadn't expected something so simple to hold so much weight. Jack kept going. "She calls it the Dreaming Hill, says it's where the clouds talk to her, where the trees whisper when they think no one's listening. This place. It's the only constant we've had since Lily passed. It's the one part of the world I could keep still for her. Safe." Claire stepped up beside him, looking out over the field, the old apple trees swaying lightly in the breeze. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's not about beauty," Jack said. "It's about meaning, roots, the kind you don't have to see to feel." She was quiet again, absorbing his words like they were bricks being laid into something she hadn't known she was building. "I didn't know," she said softly. Jack nodded. "Most people don't ask." They stood there a while longer, not speaking, just looking. And in that silence, Claire began to understand. This wasn't just land to Jack Morgan. It was memory. It was legacy. It was the heartbeat of a life quietly held together with weathered hands and a child's hope. The invitation came unexpectedly, tucked into the end of a conversation that had almost ended too early. Jack was tightening the last bracket on the gatepost when Claire stepped closer, holding 2 paper cups of cocoa, steam curling from the tops. "For you and Ellie," she said, offering them with a shy smile. "If you're not busy later, I'm staying in a little cabin just down by the creek. Nothing fancy, but it's warm. You're both welcome to stop by. I figured maybe we could just talk, no fences involved." Jack looked at the cups, then at her. "Cocoa?" She shrugged. It's what people offer when they want to make peace without saying too much. He gave a low chuckle. Ellie will like that. That evening, just after sunset, he and Ellie followed the dirt path behind the orchard until they reached the cabin, small, weather-worn, and tucked between trees like it had grown there on purpose. Light spilled softly from the windows. Smoke rose from the chimney in lazy spirals. Claire greeted them at the door, wearing thick socks and a sweater 2 sizes too big. Her hair was pulled up, her face flushed from the fire inside. Ellie was the first to enter, immediately gravitating to the oversized armchair near the wood stove. "It smells like cinnamon in here," she said, delighted. Claire grinned. "Secret recipe." Jack stepped in slower, noticing the papers spread out on the table. Notebooks, floor plans, maps, legal-looking documents tucked halfway under a folded sweater. He tried not to stare, but it was hard to miss the faint outline of the hill drawn in ink across one of the pages. Claire noticed. She didn't move to hide them, didn't explain. Just set down fresh cups and turned back to the stove. "I thought cocoa sounded better than coffee for a night like this," she said casually. Jack nodded, but his eyes lingered on the table a moment longer. Ellie sipped happily, feet swinging above the rug, completely unaware of the tension that curled just under the surface. Claire sat across from them, legs folded under her, smile warm but quiet. And for the next hour, they didn't talk about maps or deeds or deadlines. They just drank cocoa. 3 people sitting in the glow of firelight, pretending, for a little while, that the world outside didn't carry hard choices waiting to be made. They left the cabin just after 9, the night air crisp and clear, stars scattered above like someone had spilled salt across velvet. Jack carried Ellie on his back halfway down the trail, her head resting on his shoulder, warm breath steady against his neck. She'd dozed off by the fire with an empty mug in her lap and a crayon clutched in her hand. Claire had insisted they stay longer, but Jack knew the hill by heart, knew when the wind turned sharp and the coyotes got bold. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, throwing soft shadows against the walls. On the coffee table, beneath the stack of real estate folders Claire had quietly slid aside, something new remained. A crayon drawing. It was childlike and lopsided, the proportions skewed the way only a 7-year-old could get away with. But it was unmistakable, a hill. A little house with smoke curling from the chimney, and 3 figures standing in front of it, one tall, one small, and one with a scribbled ponytail. Claire reached for it slowly, fingertips brushing over the waxy paper. The word home was scrawled in big letters above the roofline. Beneath it, me, Dad, and Miss Claire. She didn't smile, not right away. Instead, she stared at it for a long while, as if reading more between the lines than what Ellie had drawn. The house didn't look like the cabin. It looked like something more permanent, something imagined but wanted. And the hill? She recognized the curve of it, the way Ellie had drawn the trees to one side and the orchard on the other. It wasn't just any hill. It was his hill, their hill. Claire folded the paper gently, carefully, like it was something sacred, and slipped it into her purse, not tucked away like trash, but stored like a keepsake, something worth protecting. Outside, the cold wind rustled the trees. Inside, the drawing sat folded among legal documents, floor plans, and contracts with numbers too big to say aloud. But none of those papers meant as much as the one drawn in crayon, where a little girl dreamed of a home and had unknowingly offered Claire a place inside it. The hardware store smelled like pine and diesel and memory. Rows of tools Jack didn't need but always wandered past anyway. He was there for nails, nothing fancy, just enough to reinforce the south gate before the snow set in. Ellie was at school, and the silence in his truck had followed him in, hanging over his shoulders like a heavy coat. He was standing near the back counter, waiting for the clerk to ring up the box in his hand, when he heard it. "Yeah, paid in full, cash, whole Turner property and then some." Jack's ears sharpened. The voice belonged to Gary, the part-time stock guy who always spoke too loud when gossip felt fresh. "You serious?" another employee asked from behind a stack of PVC pipes. "Dead serious," Gary said, lowering his voice just enough to make people lean in. "Name's on the paperwork now, Claire Whitmore." The name hit like a slap. The box of nails slipped from Jack's hand and hit the floor with a clatter that turned heads. Gary looked up. "You good, Jack?" Jack didn't answer. Couldn't. His fingers flexed at his sides like they didn't know what to hold on to. He bent to retrieve the box, but the air felt too thin, like the walls had shrunk in on him. Claire Whitmore. He hadn't known her last name until now, hadn't needed to. Just Claire had been enough. The woman who fixed fences with him, who drank cocoa by firelight, who smiled when Ellie talked about acorns and tree houses and forever. But Whitmore wasn't just a name. It was a name. It was money. It was power. It was the kind of name that didn't just buy land. It bought futures, bent rules, rewrote maps. And she'd been walking their fields, sipping his coffee, sitting in his silence, all the while knowing something he hadn't. She didn't just buy the land. She bought his land. He straightened slowly, the nails now heavier in his hand than they had any right to be. The hum of the store faded beneath the sound of blood rushing in his ears. Claire hadn't just stepped into his world. She'd rewritten it, and hadn't said a word. The wind was picking up by the time Jack reached the cabin, dry leaves spinning across the trail like they knew a storm was coming. He didn't knock, didn't need to. The front door was slightly ajar, warm light spilling out into the dusk like an invitation, or a trap. Claire looked up from the small kitchen table when he stepped inside. She had a mug in her hand and a book open beside her, but she wasn't reading. Not really. She must have seen the look in his eyes because her expression shifted instantly. Softness replaced by something cautious. "Jack," she said slowly, setting the mug down, You bought it," he cut in, his voice sharp, cracking at the edges. "The land. My land." Claire stood, her palms flat on the table. "Jack, Why didn't you tell me who you were?" he asked, louder now. "Claire Whitmore. Of course that name means something, but you never said it, not once." She opened her mouth, but he didn't give her the chance. "You stood on that hill with me, watched my daughter plant acorns, sat in my home like you were just someone passing through. Why pretend?" "I wasn't pretending," she said, steady but quiet. "I was trying to be honest in the only way I knew how." Jack laughed, but there was no humor in it, just disbelief, and something older. Something like betrayal. You had contracts in your bag and maps on your table. You knew before you ever met me, before Ellie handed you a drawing of the only home she's ever known. Claire stepped around the table, closer now. "You think I bought that land to take it from you?" "I don't know what to think anymore about," he said. "You didn't even ask. You didn't give me the chance to fight for it. You just wrote a check." "I bought it to protect it," she said, her voice rising for the first time. "To protect you. And her. Because I saw what was coming. And I knew you'd never be able to outbid the people lined up behind me." Jack stared at her, chest heaving. "You should have told me," he whispered. "That's all I needed." Claire's eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. She just stood there, in a room full of warmth that suddenly felt unbearably cold. And Jack walked out the door. It was 2 days before they saw each other again. The town felt smaller with silence between them. Jack kept to the shop, hands busy with oil changes and timing belts he didn't need to replace. He didn't tell Ellie what had happened. She asked why Claire hadn't stopped by. He told her people get busy sometimes. But the quiet was heavy. Claire didn't force it. No calls. No showing up with cocoa or apples or explanations dressed as small talk. When Jack finally did come back to the cabin, it wasn't to yell. It was because he didn't know how to carry the weight of it anymore, not without hearing it from her. She opened the door before he could knock, as if she'd been waiting. No smile, just tired eyes and the same too big sweater. "Come in," she said. Jack stepped inside. The maps were gone. The table was cleared. Just the fire, the quiet, and a cup of tea sitting untouched by the window. Claire sat first, not on the couch, on the floor, legs crossed, like she was grounding herself. "I didn't come here to lie to you," she said. "I came to disappear." Jack didn't speak. She went on. 6 months ago, I was giving speeches in glass towers about growth and innovation. People quoted me. Investors followed my every word, but I felt hollow, like I was building things that didn't mean anything anymore. My name opened doors, but it stopped meaning me a long time ago. She looked up at him. Maple Ridge wasn't a destination. It was an escape. I rented the cabin without thinking, brought work with me because I didn't know how to not work. Then I saw you, Ellie, that hill. And for the first time in years, something felt still. Jack's jaw tightened. Then why buy it without telling me? Her voice was soft. Because I panicked. I saw your name wasn't on the deed. Saw developers circling. I've spent a lifetime watching money eat places like this alive. I didn't want that to happen here. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something folded. Ellie's crayon drawing. I didn't buy it for profit, Claire said. I bought it because of what you said, because it's where you breathe and where your daughter dreams. Jack didn't know what to say, so he didn't. He just stood there, heart cracking open in the quiet, wondering how a stranger could understand so much and still leave him unsure of everything. Except one thing, she hadn't just come to the town. She'd started to belong to it. The wind picked up as Jack stepped out of the cabin, the screen door creaking behind him, like it too was reluctant to close. The sky above Maple Ridge had turned a deep shade of steel, clouds rolling in thick and low, swollen with the kind of weight that promised rain or something heavier. He didn't look back, didn't speak. His boots crunched along the gravel path like the sound could drown out the noise inside his chest. Claire hadn't chased him. Maybe she knew better. By the time he reached the truck, he could feel the storm behind his ribs more than above his head. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than they needed to. His knuckles white. The heater clicked on, blowing stale air, but it did nothing to clear the fog pressing against the windows, or the one inside him. She'd bought the land, claimed it was to save it, claimed it was because of what he had said, but good intentions didn't always feel like kindness when they showed up in secret. Back home, Ellie was curled on the living room rug, sketching in that same pad she carried everywhere now. Crayon trees, purple hills, a new drawing every day. She looked up when he walked in, and her smile faltered the moment she saw his face. "Did you see Miss Claire?" she asked quietly. Jack nodded, hanging up his jacket, boots still wet with muddy road. What happened? He paused, hands still, then sat down beside her, elbows resting on his knees. "She bought the land," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "The hill, the orchard, all of it." Ellie blinked, confused. "But why?" Jack opened his mouth, then closed it again. He rubbed his face, let out a breath that felt like it carried years with it. "She said it was to protect it. To protect us." Ellie chewed her lip, unsure, then softly, "Is she a bad guy?" Jack didn't answer right away. The question hit deeper than she could have known. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low, rough. "I don't think so." He looked out the window at the darkening sky. "But right now, I don't know what to feel at all." The next morning brought a thin drizzle and the kind of quiet that wrapped around the house like a heavy quilt. Jack moved slowly, making breakfast out of habit more than hunger. Pancakes that browned too much on one side, coffee that sat untouched on the counter. He watched the rain tap against the window, his mind still caught in the space between Claire's words and the truth he wasn't sure how to measure. Ellie was unusually silent, sitting at the kitchen table with her crayons spread out in front of her, but untouched. Instead, she was writing, tongue poking out slightly, brows furrowed, pencil gripped tight in her little hand. Jack glanced over. "What you working on?" She didn't look up. "A letter? To who?" "Miss Claire." Jack hesitated. "What's it say?" Ellie stopped writing just long enough to meet his eyes. "It's private, but nice." He didn't push, just nodded and went back to staring at his coffee. Later that afternoon, while Jack fixed the back door hinge, Ellie slipped out in her raincoat. When he looked up, she was coming back up the porch steps, boots muddy and cheeks flushed. "You go somewhere?" he asked, wiping his hands. She nodded and held up a red envelope, now damp at the corners. "I mailed it." "To Claire?" She nodded again. "I found her name at the post office. She has a box now." Jack didn't say anything at first, just stared at her, at this little girl with eyes too wide for her age and a heart that refused to build walls even when she'd been given every reason to. "What did you write?" he asked gently. Ellie shrugged, tugging off her boots. "Just that I hope she doesn't leave, that I think she's supposed to be here." Jack felt something shift in his chest, soft and aching and unbearably true. Later that night, as he tucked Ellie into bed and watched her drift off to sleep, he found himself wondering if words from a child carried more weight than all the silence between two adults. Because somehow, in just a few crayon-scrawled lines, Ellie had said the one thing he hadn't been brave enough to: "Please don't go." It came in the afternoon mail, folded between an electric bill and a hardware catalog. A plain envelope, no return address, just his name in tidy handwriting, careful, unmistakably hers. Jack didn't open it right away. He stood on the porch with it in his hand, the late autumn wind pulling at the corners like it was trying to open it for him. Inside, three things: a check, unsigned, a blank line where a name should be, and an amount written out in neat, unwavering penmanship, enough to pay off the land 10 times over, enough to start over anywhere he wanted if he chose to cash it. A second sheet, a deed transfer application, official, unmarked, waiting for a name, his name, and a note, just a single line, written on thick, cream-colored stationery. "Your name belongs on this land." No explanation, no pitch, no apology, just that. Jack sat down on the porch steps, the envelope beside him, the paper trembling faintly in his fingers. The weight of it wasn't in the ink or the numbers, it was in the silence, in the space between what she hadn't said and what he knew she meant. She wasn't trying to buy him out. She was trying to give it back, all of it, the hill, the orchard, the fence they'd rebuilt with shared breath and splinters, the moments with Ellie, the quiet conversations, the possibility that two people from different worlds had found something worth protecting in a field most people would overlook. He stared at the unsigned check for a long time, folded it once, slid it back into the envelope. Then he looked out at the hill where Ellie was chasing leaves, her laughter rising above the wind, and wondered how many second chances life gave without asking for anything in return. Jack didn't know what he would do with the papers just yet. But one thing was clear. Claire hadn't just left him with a decision. She'd left him with trust. The garage smelled like engine oil, rust, and memory. Jack had cracked the big bay door open just enough to let the night air in, cool and quiet, brushing past his shoulders as he leaned over the hood of an old '89 Ford that hadn't run right since June. It wasn't urgent work. The owner hadn't called in weeks. But it gave him something to do with his hands, something to keep the thoughts from crowding too loud in his head. The envelope sat on the workbench behind him, unopened since he'd folded it back shut. He didn't need to read it again. He could still hear the words. "Your name belongs on this land." He tightened a bolt that didn't need it. Replaced a hose that probably would have lasted another year. Wiped grease from his hands with the same rag he'd used since before Ellie was born. The silence stretched thick around him, filled only by the soft tick of the cooling engine and the whisper of memories he never meant to unearth tonight. He remembered the way Lily used to sit on the tailgate during nights like this, legs swinging, her voice humming low to a radio that barely worked. She always said the hill behind the house was their secret treasure. One day, she'd told him once, "I want to build something up there, a little place with a wide porch and wildflowers instead of carpet." Jack had laughed back then, told her they'd need a miracle to afford it. She said miracles were just slow decisions that finally got brave. Now the land was his, or nearly, if he wanted it. If he believed in the kind of miracle that came with blank checks and quiet gestures. He turned the wrench again, but his grip faltered. He missed her laugh most of all, that soft, surprised sound she made when something caught her off guard. The kind of laugh that felt like sunlight. Would she have trusted Claire? Would she have told him to stop running from Grace just because it didn't come in the package he expected? Jack leaned against the truck, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of it all press down on him. Maybe the question wasn't whether Claire had done the right thing. Maybe it was whether he had the courage to accept it. The sky was still holding its breath when Jack pulled up to the cabin. That soft, golden moment right before sunrise, when the world hasn't quite woken up and everything feels like it's waiting. He didn't park close, didn't want the crunch of tires to announce him. He walked the last stretch with the envelope in his coat pocket and a weight on his chest that didn't feel as heavy as it had the night before. Light glowed faintly through the cabin windows. She was up. Of course she was. Claire didn't strike him as the kind of woman who slept through the dawn. He stood on the porch for a second, unsure if he should knock or just turn back and carry the silence a little longer. But then the door opened. She stood there barefoot, a sweater pulled tight around her frame, hair still tangled from sleep. Her eyes met his, tired but steady, like she'd already braced for every outcome. Jack didn't speak right away, just pulled the envelope from his pocket and held it out. She looked at it, then back at him. "You don't have to." "I'm not here to return it," he said softly. "I'm here to answer it." Claire stepped back slightly, giving him room to come inside. He didn't. "I don't want your money," Jack continued, voice firmer now, steadier with every word. "Not because it's not generous, not because I'm too proud, but because that land, it's not something I can put a price on. It's part of us now, me and Ellie. It's tied to Lily, to everything we've held together with duct tape and hope." Claire's eyes shimmered. She didn't speak, just listened. "But," Jack said, taking a breath, "I'd like to build something, with you, from scratch." She blinked. "You mean the house?" He shook his head, then smiled, small but real. "Not just the house." Claire stepped forward, the space between them closing with quiet steps. "You sure?" "No," Jack said, "but I'm sure I want to try." The sun crested the edge of the trees behind him, bathing the porch in light. And for the first time in weeks, Jack Morgan didn't feel like he was losing anything. He felt like he was about to begin. The next morning they sat side by side at Claire's kitchen table, a mess of paper between them. Scraps, napkins, notebook pages, and the back of Ellie's old homework assignments. No lawyers, no contracts, just two people with pencils and calloused hands trying to build something honest out of what had nearly fallen apart. Jack drew a rough outline of a house, simple, square, a big porch wrapped around the front, a small loft up top where Ellie could hang dream catchers in the window. "Nothing fancy," he muttered, shading in the roof, "just strong, and quiet, and ours." Claire nodded, tucking her knees under her chair as she pulled her own pad closer. Her sketches weren't of walls or beams, but rows of green, boxes for herbs, fruit trees near the orchard line, a winding path that looped around a low stone bench. "We could call it the growing place," she said, "for kids, for anyone who needs to feel something, take root again." They didn't talk about ownership. There were no percentages, no names on paper. Jack had folded the deed transfer back into the envelope the night before and slid it across the table. "I don't need it to say it's mine," he'd told her. "If it's ours, that's better." Claire hadn't argued. She just placed the envelope in a drawer next to her spoons and nodded like trust was more binding than signatures. Now, as she penciled little B's into the corners of her garden plans, Jack leaned over to look. "You always draw this much detail?" "Only when it matters," she said with a soft smile. Ellie bounded into the room 10 minutes later, took one look at the table and gasped. "Are we making plans?" Jack grinned. "Looks like it." Ellie reached for a crayon. "Can I help?" Claire handed her a blank page. Of course. And just like that, the dream became shared. Not inherited, not purchased, built. One sketch at a time, one route at a time, one morning where no one had to ask if they belonged, because they already knew. The morning was crisp, the sky clear enough to feel like a blessing. Jack stood at the edge of the hill, holding a wooden stake in one hand and a mallet in the other. Claire stood beside him, bundled in a jacket 2 sizes too big, her breath forming soft clouds in the cool air. Ellie danced nearby, arms full of wildflowers she'd picked from the edge of the orchard, hair tangled from sleep, but eyes bright with something bigger than excitement, belonging. Jack looked down at the stake, rough cut and weathered, the kind of thing most people wouldn't think twice about. But today, it meant everything. This wasn't just marking a line in the dirt. This was where a life would begin again. "You ready?" he asked, glancing at Claire. She didn't answer with words, just nodded, her hands slipping into the pocket of his jacket like they'd always belonged there. Together they knelt, positioning the stake at the spot they'd agreed on, the beginning of the path, right where the trees started to thin, and the breeze always seemed to find you. Jack held it steady, while Claire lifted the mallet and brought it down, slow and sure, the sound echoing in the quiet field like a promise. Thump, thump, thump. They traded off, each swing a silent vow, to build, to grow, to stay. When the stake stood firm in the soil, Ellie stepped forward and gently laid a single wildflower beside it, bright yellow, petals trembling in the breeze. "This is our beginning," Claire whispered, her voice almost lost in the wind. Jack reached for her hand, and Ellie slipped hers into the other, the three of them standing there in a quiet triangle, held together not by blood but by choice. The wind rustled through the grass, the trees swayed gently, and the first line of their new life was written, not in ink, but in earth. The headline hit before noon. Claire Whitmore walks away from Whitmore Industries. No statement given. It spread like wildfire. Jack saw it first in the diner, flashing across the little TV mounted in the corner above the coffee station. The local news anchor read it like it was gospel, her voice laced with disbelief. One of the country's most powerful CEOs has reportedly stepped back from her company without notice or explanation. The regulars looked up from their plates. Half recognized the name. The other half pretended they hadn't heard it whispered around town. Back in the city, the reaction was louder. Investors called emergency meetings. Stockholders demanded answers. Board members exchanged emails laced with panic and betrayal. The woman who had built a billion-dollar empire from the ground up had simply stopped showing up. No quarterly call, no press release, no elegant spin to soften the blow. The new chairman tried to play it down. "Claire's on sabbatical," he told the press. "She's just taking time to recharge. She'll be back." But she wouldn't. Because while they scrambled to salvage the brand she left behind, Claire was in a flannel shirt, helping Jack move lumber across a muddy field. While they filled conference rooms with speculation, she was teaching Ellie how to dig garden rows without disturbing the roots. Jack didn't ask about the backlash. He didn't need to. Claire's silence said more than any headline could. She wasn't hiding. She was choosing. Let them talk. Let the markets worry and the media spin stories that tried to explain the unexplainable, because the truth wasn't for them. It was here, on a hill, with dirt beneath her fingernails and laughter rising from the orchard. It was in the wildflowers Ellie picked, in the blueprint on Jack's workbench, in the way she breathed now, easier, fuller. Claire Whitmore hadn't abandoned anything. She'd finally come home. The ground was soft from the last rain, the kind of damp that made digging feel like folding into the earth instead of fighting it. Claire knelt beside Ellie near the base of the hill, her sleeves rolled up, palms already smudged with soil. A bucket sat between them, filled with acorns Ellie had collected all summer long, some smooth, some cracked, all chosen with care. "This one's for the sun," Ellie said, holding up a fat little acorn, "so the trees will always grow toward it." Claire smiled and took it gently from her hand, placing it in the shallow hole they dug together. "What about that one?" she asked, pointing to a smaller, slightly crooked acorn. Ellie cradled it like something fragile. "This one's special. It has a wish in it." Claire tilted her head. "And what did you wish for?" Ellie looked up at the sky, then toward the orchard where Jack was hammering planks for the future garden fence. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pressed the acorn into the dirt with both hands, then covered it tenderly. When she finally spoke, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "I want Claire to stay," she whispered, like she was telling it to the wind. Claire's heart caught in her throat. Ellie wiped her hands on her overalls and reached for the next seed. "Dad says big things grow from small starts, so if I plant the right wish, maybe it'll come true." Claire didn't speak, couldn't. She just sat there in the soil beside her. No boardrooms, no headlines, no stakes to weigh her down. Just this child, this moment, and a field where hope had quietly taken root. Together they kept planting, acorn after acorn, wish after wish, some spoken aloud, one for kindness, one for snow that doesn't cancel school, and others whispered so softly even the breeze had to lean in to hear. By the time they finished, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the row of tiny mounds. The forest hadn't grown yet, but something already had. The invitation was written in marker on a stack of scrap paper flyers and tacked to bulletin boards all over town, outside the feed store, inside Rosie's diner, even taped to the church door. No RSVP, no fancy fonts. Just 6 words and a hand-drawn apple tree, picnic on the hill. All welcome. By midday Saturday, the field was alive. Checkered blankets dotted the grass. Folding tables overflowed with cornbread, fried chicken, potato salad, and more homemade pies than the county fair could dream of. Someone brought a guitar. Someone else brought lemonade in a jug big enough to drown in. Kids ran through the orchard like the trees were part of a maze, only they understood. Jack stood near the new gate, watching it all unfold. The laughter, the stories, the quiet way people softened when they had nowhere else to be but together. Claire moved among them with easy grace, handing out plates, refilling drinks, helping an older couple set up their chairs under the oak. Her hair was pulled back, boots muddy, sleeves rolled up past her elbows. No one recognized her at first, not as her, but then the whispers started. "Isn't that the Whitmore woman?" "You mean that Claire?" "No way. She's just helping with the lemonade." Someone finally asked Jack directly, curiosity too thick to ignore. "Is she really, her?" Jack didn't answer right away, just looked across the hill to where Claire was crouched beside Ellie, helping her string a daisy chain like it was the most important task in the world. Then he turned back to the question. "She's one of us now," he said simply, with a smile that made the answer final. No headlines, no spotlight. Just a woman in the grass, laughing with a little girl who once wished for her to stay. And a town that didn't need her title, just her presence. They ate, they laughed. They stayed until the stars came out and the pie was gone. And the hill, once quiet and uncertain, had never felt more full of life. They heard the van before they saw it. Tires crunching gravel, engine humming too clean for a vehicle that belonged out here. Jack looked up from the picnic table he was folding, his hand still sticky with peach cobbler. Across the field, Claire was helping Ellie tie ribbons around the posts of their newly planted wish tree. The laughter between them floated through the late afternoon breeze. The van came to a stop just beyond the orchard fence. Big letters on the side read, "Local Channel 7 News," the kind of logo that made towns like Maple Ridge uneasy. A young reporter stepped out, all polished shoes and perfect posture, followed by a cameraman adjusting his gear. Claire saw them instantly. She stood slowly, brushing grass from her flannel shirt and wiping her hands on her jeans. No rush, no panic, just a calm steadiness as she made her way down the slope, boots crunching with every step. The reporter looked eager. "Claire Whitmore, I'm Madison Bell, Channel 7. We'd love to get a quick interview. Can you comment on why you left your company and what brought you to a place like this?" Claire stopped a few feet away, her arms loose at her sides, eyes steady. "There's no story here," she said quietly. Madison blinked. "Ma'am, with all due respect, the entire state is wondering—" "It's just people helping people," Claire interrupted. "That's it." She didn't smile for the camera, didn't offer a headline or a soundbite, just turned toward the field, where Ellie was now waving at her with a flower in hand. "If you're looking for drama," Claire added, voice soft but firm, "you won't find it on this hill." The reporter hesitated, then lowered her mic. The cameraman, sensing it was over, slowly turned off the lens. Claire nodded once and walked back to Ellie, leaving the press in her dust. Boots muddy, flannel rumpled, heart anchored to a place that didn't need a byline to prove it mattered. The news van didn't stay long. By sunset it was gone, and all that remained was a hill full of people, who already knew the only story worth telling. The morning sun cut through the mist like a promise, warming the dew that clung to the wild grass near the top of the hill. Jack stood just beneath the old oak tree, with a length of weathered cedar balanced across two sawhorses. His pocket knife, the one Lily gave him on their 3rd anniversary, moved steadily through the grain. He wasn't a professional carver. His hands were more familiar with engines and exhaust than fine detail. But this wasn't about perfection. It was about meaning. Letter by letter, he worked slowly. The wood curled away in soft shavings, catching the light as they fell. When he finally stepped back, sweat on his brow and dust on his jeans, the words were rough but clear. Turner Hill, built on trust. He ran a hand across the letters. The edges still raw. Trust. It had taken weeks of questions, of silence, of reckoning. But here he was, still here, still building. Claire arrived a little while later with Ellie at her side, a small wooden plaque cradled in her arms. She didn't say anything right away, just looked at the sign Jack had made, then smiled that quiet, aching kind of smile that said more than applause ever could. "I thought maybe it needed one more thing," she said softly. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" She nodded and knelt in front of the larger post, pressing her smaller sign gently into the soft earth just below his. "And dreams," it read, carved in her cleaner, steadier hand, every curve careful and full of hope. Jack didn't speak for a moment. He just watched her, the way she knelt beside his work, not to change it, not to replace it, but to complete it. Ellie stepped between them, threading her fingers into both of theirs. "It's perfect," she said. Together they lifted the sign into place at the top of the hill. Not just a name, not just a marker, a declaration of trust, of beginnings, of second chances not asked for, but earned. And for the first time in a long time, Jack Morgan felt like he wasn't just fixing what was broken. He was building something meant to last. The bus doors folded open with a hiss, and a wave of excited chatter spilled out onto the gravel drive. Ellie was the first one down, wearing her favorite yellow rain boots and a lopsided ponytail. She turned toward her teacher and classmates, face lit with something bigger than pride, something like belonging. "Okay," she announced, arms stretched wide. "Welcome to Turner Hill." Jack stood near the fence, wiping his hands on a rag, grinning as the kids poured out like bees from a hive. Behind him, Claire waved from the porch of the half-built house, her flannel sleeves rolled up, sawdust in her hair. The orchard was glowing in the afternoon sun, branches heavy with apples that hadn't been picked yet. Ellie led her classmates down the path she knew by heart, pointing to the trees she and Claire had named, the ones they'd trimmed, the ones with ribbons tied around their trunks. Dream trees, Ellie called them. "This one's Daisy," she said, patting a twisted little apple tree with a bent trunk. "She's small, but she grows the best apples. Just don't tell the others." The kids giggled, huddled around her like she was telling a secret. Her teacher followed behind, clearly charmed, camera swinging from her neck as she took notes for a future newsletter. "And over here," Ellie continued, bouncing up the hill, "is the new house. My dad's building it, but Claire's helping too. She's really good at making garden maps and drawing porches." The kids gathered at the construction site's edge, where planks of wood and outlines of future rooms waited beneath an open sky. No walls yet, just a skeleton of what was coming. But Ellie didn't see what was missing. She saw what would be. "That part's going to be the kitchen," she said confidently. "Claire makes the best apple cider, and over there, by the window, is where I'm putting my reading chair." One of the boys raised his hand. "Who's Claire?" Ellie looked over her shoulder at the woman smiling from the porch. "She's kind of like our missing piece." Jack, watching from a few yards away, swallowed the lump in his throat. And for the rest of the day, the hill echoed with laughter, little footsteps, and the stories of a girl who was already giving tours of a life that hadn't even finished being built. The frame of the house stood like a skeleton against the sky, all open beams and half-whispered promises. The sun was dipping low, casting amber light through the empty window frames and painting long shadows across the dirt floor. Jack stood inside what would one day be the living room, hands on his hips, staring out toward the orchard as the breeze rustled through the exposed rafters above. Behind him, footsteps. Soft, familiar. Claire stepped through the unfinished doorway, her boots scuffed, hair wind-tangled, sawdust clinging to the sleeves of her flannel. She paused, watching him, noticing how at home he looked, even with nothing finished, maybe because nothing was finished. "I like this view," she said, her voice low, carrying in the stillness. Jack turned, offering a small smile. "I planned it that way. You can see the trees change colors from here." She walked to him, stopping beneath the main crossbeam where sunlight filtered through the gaps in the roof. For a moment, neither of them said anything, just stood there, wrapped in the quiet of something unspoken. Then Claire reached into her coat pocket. No box, no ribbon, no ring, just a folded piece of paper, Ellie's crayon drawing, edges worn, the one with the house on the hill and 3 little figures holding hands beneath it. "I bought the land," she said, looking up at him, "but you gave it meaning. You gave it roots." Jack's eyes searched hers, but he didn't speak. Claire took a breath. "So if you'll have me, I'd like to stay for good." There was no flash, no kneeling, no script, just words real and bare, offered beneath beams that hadn't yet known a ceiling. Jack stepped closer, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to close the space between them. "You sure?" he asked, voice rough. Claire nodded. "I've never been more." He didn't need to say yes. He just kissed her, slow, steady, like a man sealing something sacred with his whole heart. And above them, the house stood still, waiting, ready. Years later, when the orchard was taller and the house had settled into the land like it had always belonged there, people still talked about Turner Hill. Not because it was the biggest farm or the most profitable or the kind of place that made headlines. No, people talked about it in the way they talk about stories that feel like they belong to everyone. They spoke of the man who rebuilt a fence he didn't own, just to keep a little girl's favorite hill safe. Of the woman who walked out of boardrooms and into a field, not to claim it, but to give it back its meaning. Of the girl who planted acorns with wishes buried beneath them, believing that trees and people could grow into exactly what they were meant to be. They say if you drive past Turner Hill on a Sunday morning, you'll see them. Jack, leaning against the gatepost, coffee in one hand, other resting lightly on Claire's waist, her flannel sleeves rolled up, eyes soft, as she watches Ellie race the wind through the orchard, taller now, but still wild at heart. A swing hangs from the old oak. A sign rests in the grass, aged but proud. Turner Hill. Built on trust. Below it, still steady. And dreams. Neighbors wave as they pass. Some stop to pick apples. Others just smile and say, they did it. Somehow they really did it. Because it wasn't just a house they built. It wasn't just land they saved. It was a life, stitched together by kindness, held in place by risk. And it all began with a stranger, a woman in a wool coat, a fence left broken after a storm, and a man who didn't expect anything in return, but offered everything anyway. Some stories grow slowly, like roots pushing quietly through earth. Others arrive like lightning, changing the shape of the sky. But the best ones? They live on the fence line, right where two worlds meet, and choose not to pull apart, but to grow together.